I am at, or at least in some sense near, 221B Baker Street, because where else could I be to talk about 1992's Sherlock Holmes, The Lost Files, the case of the Serrated Scalpel. Except that's not really 221B Baker Street. It's actually 239. Also, where else could I be would be like inside where it's not so windswept. In fact, 221B was reallocated from down the road here, the old Abbey National headquarters. But even this address, so iconic that the Abbey National employed a full-time secretary to answer letters from Sherlock Holmes fans, did not exist when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote his first story. At the time, this stretch of road was separated from the rest of Baker Street by York Place and was known as Upper Baker Street. The Baker Streets were only united and renumbered in the 1930s, and 221B was given to this Art Deco building upon its construction in 1932, 5 years after the publication of the last Sherlock Holmes short story, The Adventure of Shoscombe Old Place. Originally, Conan Doyle decided that his characters, then named Sherrinford Holmes with his companion Dr. Ormond Sacker, would live in Upper Baker Street. But as Sherrinford Holmes became Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Ormond Sacker became Dr. John Watson, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle decided to set his characters flat in this part of Baker Street, a slightly posher part at the time, despite street numbers going no higher than 85. Oh, yeah. Video games, that's what this was supposed to be about, wasn't it? Yes, The Lost Files of Sherlock Holmes. Written by Mythos Software and published by Electronic Arts in 1992. Sitting in that odd transition between the EA who made high-quality artistic games for home computers in the 1980s and the EA of after that, which basically made, well, money. So while this may seem like a game from the old EA, it does mostly exist because Mythos were young, small, and therefore willing to work for cheap. In a roundabout way, all of this street numbering and tangential detail about the origin of Holmes gave me the idea for how I'd cover The Lost Files. See, it's good. It's a great adventure, and if you like point and clicks, I'd absolutely recommend playing it to see a different take on the genre, which relies on deduction and observation over inventory puzzles. A deliberate decision from the Mythos team, who felt spending half an hour building a ladder out of spoons, instead of just asking Lestrade to get something down for you, wasn't authentic to how Holmes would operate. But merely saying, "It's good, look," would also be a 30-second video for me to tell you this, unless I started spoiling the game's story. And I really don't want to spoil the game's story, because while it starts a little slowly with a lot of bustling back and forth between the same few locations, once you get to the mid-game you discover a complex, tangled mystery, full of Victorian skullduggery, dramatic deaths, and villains who turn out to be working for other villains who turn out to be working for yet more villains. So instead we're going to stick to the early game and wander around trying to uncover Holmes's London to see if we can discover the world of the game and find out who exactly was Sherlock Holmes. The game is afoot. I mean, you've got to say that. It's not Sherlock Holmes if you don't say that. It's not even one of those beam me up Scotty situations, or indeed an Elementary My Dear Watson situation. He actually says that game is afoot line verbatim in 1904's The Adventure of the Abbey Grange. Come, Watson, come. The game is spread over 9 floppy disks. Seriously, for real it is. That is a stack. Now, part of this is down to the game including some short sequences with digitised speech. And this took me by surprise, as once the intro is out of the way, the main one comes late in the game, at a pivotal moment for the plot. I almost lost track of what was going on, being so distracted by everyone starting speaking, which you don't really expect halfway through something you've just installed from floppies. Disk usage aside, not only do these small cutscenes give us a brief glimpse of the digitised speech future, but they also allow Sherlock to show his action hero side, without forcing the player to break out of calm, methodical puzzle solving and do any of that unpleasant, actual action gaming. As far as voice goes, this is as much as you get on the PC. There were later CD-ROM re-releases, but these appear to be just the floppy disk version again, although the Hit Squad budget release does give you the option of playing entirely from the CD. The game was ported to the 3DO, where it gained speech throughout, including actors in full-motion video thumbnails replacing the character portraits, but as we know, I wasn't allowed to enter that bad influence competition, so I never did get a 3DO. Still, this is notionally 1992, a year in which we were perfectly happy doing the voices in our head and playing our adventure games on the good old IBM PC and 100% compatibles. Sherlock Holmes is an ideal character for an adventure game. Thematically, a freelance master detective who operates by noticing tiny details and making seemingly baffling leaps of logic. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle pretty much invented the graphic adventure character a century before anybody got round to inventing the graphic adventure. But Holmes also made sense commercially. An iconic, recognisable character with a large following, many of whom would enjoy puzzles and adventures, and crucially, one old enough to be out of copyright. Well, sort of. Sherlock Holmes entered public domain in the UK in 1980, or, well, sort of. Because Conan Doyle's first Sherlock novel, A Study in Scarlet, was published in Beeton's Christmas Annual by Ward Lock and Company in 1887. But the last came 40 years later, in 1927, and it was only the earlier stories for which copyright had expired. Think of it like Mickey Mouse. The representation from Steamboat Willie is public domain, but that doesn't mean you can use the Mickey design we're most familiar with, as it has many elements which were created in the late 30s and early 40s. And I'm sure, even when those copyrights lapse, lawyers will be earning their wages arguing that something is using character elements introduced in, say, the 1990s all-new Mickey Mouse Club rendition. This is relevant to Sherlock Holmes, as the later stories introduced a softer, more human character, sometimes referred to in fandom as Holmes 2.0, a more empathic detective who treated Watson as a friend rather than a sort of roving diary. A later court case defined 3 strict tests which would immediately identify a Holmes 2.0 story. References to Dr. Watson having a second wife, descriptions of Watson's sporting achievements, or anything relating to Sherlock Holmes retiring from his detective agency. None of which is really relevant here, as the Conan Doyle estate only started seriously asserting their copyright, what remained of it, from 1996, and Serrated Scalpel is from 1992. Scriptwriter R.J. Berg, a Holmes fanatic who'd read through the whole canon multiple times, does recall sending 2 copies of the game and some token amount of money to one of Conan Doyle's descendants to ensure things were okay, and no complaint was raised. Nor were there any issues with follow-up game The Case of the Rose Tattoo, despite that being much closer to the caring about copyright point. Still, we can look to see which version of the character Mythos aimed at, by checking whether Holmes is cold, logical and calculating throughout, he treats Watson as little more than a piece of ambulatory furniture, and the good doctor knows absolutely nothing about sport. And also no references to the giant rat of Sumatra, because fun as poking at that unwritten mystery may be, it's only brought up in The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire from 1924, and therefore very much a Holmes 2.0 element. Besides which, this game starts in November 1888. If you've got a writer who knows their Holmes, you would expect a story set in 1888 to be very definitely 1888 Holmes, copyright or no copyright. We start the game in the as yet non-existent 221B Baker Street, which is in a suitably slovenly state, with references to classic Holmes elements such as his habits of using the wall for target practice. As well as setting the scene and the character, this also gives us a load of items to click on and play around with to learn the game before we're off to the actual start at the Regency Theatre. And already there's a problem with the real world. See, the Regency Theatre was a short-lived name for what began as the New Rooms and ended as the Scala Theatre, here on Charlotte Street, just off Tottenham Court Road. The name was only used from 1815 to 1820, making it somewhat anachronistic even within the game. And to add further problems, it caught fire in 1969 and was replaced by these offices. It's also very much not on Oxford Street. Applying a bit of the old Holmes myself, I combine a few clues from the game. I'm looking for an address on Oxford Street. The curve of this road makes it clear that this is Regent Street, and therefore the theatre is slightly to the east of it. And we're looking for a building with an alleyway to the rear, preferably an alleyway which would have been there in Victorian times. Which brings us to Marks and Spencer. But that building was built in 1938 on the site of an older building called the Pantheon, which, in classic London style, burnt down, got rebuilt, burnt down again, failed as a business yet more times, but, crucially, for one short space of time between 1812 and 1814, was an actual theatre. By 1888 it was a showroom and storage facility for W&A Gilby wine merchants, but hey, I found a thing which was, at some point, an actual theatre, even if it wasn't that building. Unfortunately, while there is an alleyway behind it, it's far from what you'd call Holmesian or possibly Sherlockian if you're elsewhere in the world, let alone looking like anything from the game. Which is a shame, as Scott Mather's VGA artwork looks rather better than this nondescript utility bit of London full of mostly bins and a gym. You know, this is the point where a smarter man might consider that while period maps were indeed used to cite the locations in the game, that Mythos Software, a developer based in Arizona, might just have chosen a plausible location for the Victorians to have built a theatre, and given it a plausible sounding name, without using any actual locations or names which would have gotten them in trouble with any actual existing theatres, who might complain about the depiction of poorly maintained doors, marks on the walls, and, oh yeah, what's that other thing? A murder. This is the classic Holmes setup. Inspector Lestrade confidently announces he has already solved the case. This is clearly the work of Jack the Ripper, only for Sherlock to step in with a "don't be so sure." And I will say, in the game this is pretty justified. You investigate that corpse in detail and find a number of details which suggest this was in fact someone attempting to mimic the MO of the Ripper, but with inferior materials and a certain amount of amateur clumsiness. And it doesn't create the mystery by hiding things from you or misleading you. Like Holmes in the book, Holmes in the game is always aware when there's something more to the story, even if he doesn't know what it is yet. Now, one thing to note is that getting to the point where you can explain all this to Lestrade involves a chunk of pixel hunting. And that is a lot of what this game is about. Noticing tiny smudges, glints of metal, or objects out of place in the detailed backgrounds, or exhaustively rolling the mouse over an object of interest to see if it has a tiny sub-hotspot, which will reveal a new line of inquiry. From a mechanical perspective, I have to accept that this is kind of what being Sherlock Holmes is about. Some of these are frustrating, like the point I missed a mark which would have given me a clue to someone's height, and then couldn't get back in the room to see it again until much later. But they're not hidden object game obnoxious. Yes, you would probably breeze through the game in about half an hour if it had hotspot highlighting, but this combination of pixel hunting for clues you can use to solve dialogue puzzles feels a lot more faithful to the subject matter than having Holmes build a moustache out of cat hair. Our criticism of the character is that so much of what Holmes does relies on instant cold reading of small details other people, well, usually Lestrade, there's a template here, have missed. But what this in itself misses is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's own background. He trained and spent his early days as a doctor, and one of the prized talents of Victorian surgeons was the ability to cold read diagnoses. Conan Doyle's own tutor Joseph Bell was famed for being able to look a patient up and down and proclaim, "This man is a tailor. See by the pinpricks upon his thumbs and the way he has fashioned a bandage from waistcoat lining. He winces upon the roll of the step. This is not a complaint of the ankle, but merely a corn of the toe," and other such suitably 19th century proclamations. This feels like a fast route to a medical malpractice case today, but these were simpler times, where professions tended to leave more obvious signs of wear on the human body, and the ailments people took to doctors were simple injuries, sprains, and, let's be blunt here, quite often at least one of the later stages of alcoholism, something Conan Doyle's own father suffered from, which he would put into mini Sherlock stories, and therefore, practicing the equivalent of guessing someone got their name from their long ebony black hair with purple streaks and red tips was just about feasible. Besides, what else are you going to do for entertainment other than sit around and wait 110 years for DVD players to be invented? Holmes was cast in this mould, a detective who brought the methods of the brilliant surgeons of the day to police work. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle drew from earlier fictional detectives, such as Poe's Auguste Dupin, but aimed to create a character who was even more scientific, more grounded in real-world observations. And the game keeps this characterization, even going further. We're trying to treat the player fairly in having all the information available up front, avoiding the tendency of the original stories to resort to the occasional complete arse pull. So it will have you spot signs of macassar oil on some clothing, and then go looking for a man whose hair is plastered down with the stuff, which, with this being Victorian England, turns out to be basically everybody. So you need to tease out a few more details, like finding a place where that oily head has bumped the top of a door frame, and, you know, an actual name. And I need to tease out another location. One of the first areas to be uncovered on the game map is South Kensington Field, following a lead that has you looking for a rugby player. I can find no such place name in the real world, the closest being a neighbourhood in Liverpool called Kensington Field. I doubt we're looking for that, but the game places its fictional South Kensington Field just south of Hyde Park Corner, which leads us to Belgrave Square, the posh bit where all the embassies are. These are private gardens, though there are public heritage days where you can go inside, possibly with clauses about filming dumb videos which were, hypothetically, at some point, something to do with video games. And this would have been the case for Sherlock too. Belgrave Square was built in the 1820s and by the late Victorian era was already the site of embassies, with Sherlock visiting the Russian embassy in The Adventure of the Golden Pince-Nez. That institution moved away in 1927 and is now up near Notting Hill Gate, but at the time of publication in 1894, it was located on this southwest corner in Chesham House. They probably wouldn't have been happy about a rugby team being coached in their private garden. But in fairness to Mythos, these old London maps don't suggest any of this, showing it merely as a handily located patch of grass. Watson, incidentally, can offer a comment here about having played for Blackheath in his youth, a clear Holmes 2.0 element, also from The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire, along with that giant rat. At least we find our players residents of Eton Dormitory close by, and I guess it's plausible that one of these could have been a dormitory, at least in the days before London property prices were interchangeable with London telephone numbers. Of course, once we find our rugby player, and they're presumably affordable at the time lodgings, they refuse to talk to us until we provide some evidence that the thing we wish to talk about actually occurred. Yes, I also think that sentence is tortuous, but I'm really trying not to spoil this game if you haven't played it before. Opening new locations only to hit an immediate roadblock like this does lead to a certain amount of backtracking, and unless you already know your way through the game or are following an optimised walkthrough, you'll often visit one place, realise you need some more information, take a cab somewhere else, get the information, and take a cab back, only to realise this has only got you a single step further through a dialogue, and you need to get back in the cab to find out something else. Holmes and Watson must have quite the collection of taxi receipts. But having a sidekick around means you can converse with them, and this is one of the earlier games to give out the occasional hint or two when you talk to Watson. The Doctor is, however, rather sparing with these hints, and sometimes they serve merely to point out a puzzle that you've already spotted, or even give unhelpful suggestions to move on from a place where you still need to pick something up. But this doesn't mean you can just ignore him, as every once in a while the solution to a puzzle is buried in Watson's dialogue tree for a particular location. On a more positive note, you do get access to your companion's journal at all times, allowing you to look up what a character has said in a previous conversation. Yep, that's right, you do indeed treat him like a self-propelled diary. Albeit a useful one, when you need to search for what someone might have said about something 2 hours ago. This methodical procedural approach did lead to a few scathing reviews. In PC Zone's look at the CD-ROM re-release in August 1994, they complained that since you never seemed to do much more than go somewhere, look at some stuff, then use the information gleaned to talk to people until they opened up a new location to go and look at different stuff, there wasn't actually a game here. I think that's a bit harsh though. Yes, you can make progress by exhaustively scanning the screen for every hotspot and clicking every dialogue option until a character coughs up the goods, but the satisfaction is making smart observations and getting it right the first time. Besides, demanding every adventure game features taxing lateral thinking puzzles is how we end up with cat racing and, well, the death of adventure games. This is still relatively early in adventures though, and perhaps a sign of that is the sudden genre shift midway through the game, where you need to beat 4 people at a game of darts. It's not quite as blatant as the Sierra mandatory gambling sequence we know and love from all those AGI games, and it's not as irritating as the Space Skimmer from Space Quest 1 or the Log Raft from Larry Free, even though that is skippable if you want to lose out on the points, but still. This was a bit unexpected when I was slowly puzzling my way through finding clues and interviewing people of a quiet evening. It does turn out this is not mandatory to progress, and the game does offer an alternative route through careful observation and a little bit of blackmail. I didn't spot that, so instead I became unexpectedly good at darts. We are ticking off that character sheet for Holmes 1.0 though. The detective's habit of being suddenly very good at a thing you wouldn't expect is very much in keeping with the original stories, and we definitely proceed through the game being cold, calculating, logical, and also a little weird. Can relate. This is quite an early Holmes, with moments such as trying to track down information in a snooker club, showing him as being rather useless at the social side of things. In early stories, Conan Doyle did indeed write Holmes as being a bit of a savant, referring to his head as an attic he did not wish to clutter up with junk. So he would be a genius at chemistry, another character element which repeatedly gets put to use in Serrated Scalpel, but professes to be unaware of how the solar system works and what orbits what. Although there is a chance that was just Holmes winding up Watson. Later books would round out the detective and have him profess that understanding the social side of things made him better equipped to tease information out of suspects, but here conversations are stumbling, awkward, and often Holmes ends up reliant on paying for information or noticing some detail which makes someone panic and tell him what he needs. Or, beating everyone in the pub at darts to win the respect of the landlord. While that might be a jarring genre shift, it is at least inventive. And since so much of the game relies on talking to a character until they reveal a new location, going to that location, finding an obstructive character in that new location, then working out what they need in order to either unlock yet another new location, or allow you to pick up some object to solve a puzzle elsewhere, it's a good thing these tasks are varied. Sometimes it's noticing a small detail. Sometimes it's bringing up something another character says. Sometimes it's backtracking to grab another object from a previously visited place. And at one point there's even a classic crate moving puzzle, 6 years before Half-Life did anything of the sort. Locations tend to be given with a bit of flavour, so you won't just get the picnic site magically pop up on your map. You'll be told it's where the Brompton Road meets Earl's Court, making use of all those old maps to build up a plausible picture of London. There is indeed a picnic site where the old Brompton Road meets what could just about loosely be called Earl's Court, although this one is a little small and there's not a school in the background. But, Google Maps said it was private and I'm walking through it, so I'm counting that as a sort of win here. And someone smarter, lazier, or perhaps both might think, hey, yeah, we found a park, that's good enough, it's a rainy and drizzly day and it's kind of noisy outside. We could record the rest of this in the warm with cocoa or something like that. But no, because I looked at a lot of maps before I did this and I intend to show my homework. I think, based on the map, a closer fit is here, Stanhope Gardens, which does look suitably sized and, while it's a little overgrown to see it, has a school in the background. Also, there's some buildings in the way, even if the plants aren't, but I'm calling that a victory. It is once more private, but that's kind of the theme of today. One small extra, and probably ultimately pointless in the context of the game fact, is the Circle and District lines run pretty much directly under here, on their way to Gloucester Road, somewhere over that way. The nature of these cut and cover lines became a plot point in 1895's The Adventure of the Bruce Partington Plans, where what Conan Doyle called Caulfield Gardens, but is presumed to be here, 28 Hogarth Road, overlook a place behind Earl's Court Station where tracks run open to the sky and allow an occupant to determine whether a train is clear of the tunnels or not. This kind of sleuthing for small details in a work of fiction may seem excessive, but think about how much content is on the average wiki for almost any given animated sitcom, and then imagine a fandom which has had 137 years to obsessively track down the most minute of details. The Sherlock Holmes fandom is often cited as one of the first modern-style fandoms, with all the trappings we've come to expect, including contemporary fanfiction. None of which, as far as I'm aware, tries to recast Dr. Watson as a goffik and rename the detective to Vampire Holmes, possibly because it was the 1890s and My Chemical Romance hadn't been invented yet. And sleuthing is also quite fun, even though most of my research so far has led me to the gates of a private garden, or a building which no longer exists. I've enjoyed doing it. It helps that the game has this detailed, atmospheric and quite accurate map of Victorian London to track down likely streets, which it might never have had. Early versions featured the travel between locations taking place on a chessboard, playing off the slow but strategic way in which the case is solved. I prefer the map, except when I'm having to take a cab all the way across it to backtrack to Scotland Yard, only to find there's nothing I can do there and it's actually a clue or item in another location I've missed. These days the Met hang out at New Scotland Yard, but this is one of those rare points in this video where I don't have to point sadly at a brand new office block or private garden, because there is a suitably imposing building on the site of the original Great Scotland Yard. Or should I say Whitehall Place? Because Scotland Yard was the rear public entrance, along with other police offices and less glamorous but essential features of policing in the Victorian era, such as stables. The lack of which stables does hint at an unfortunate truth. While these buildings are indeed imposing and do look suitably Holmesian, the facades are actually Edwardian, dating from 1910. The Met itself moved out of here in 1890, with construction of the replacement building well underway by the game's setting of 1888. Getting inside and talking to Inspector Lestrade is one of the fussier puzzles in the game, requiring you to talk to someone, then get a cab back to the Southwark morgue and talk to Inspector Gregson, a character who only appeared in a few original stories but is widely represented in the extended universe, then get into the building only to find that you won't be allowed to see Lestrade unless you exit once more and talk to someone else. Oh, and you know what you unlock once you've bounced between the morgue and Scotland Yard a couple of times? More things to do at the morgue. Encountering this sort of thing early on soured some reviewers on the game, and it never seemed to get the universal glowing praise of other adventures of this time. Maybe in some ways that's fair. While the background art does have a beautiful painterly style, the muted pastel tones are sometimes hazy and indistinct compared to brighter and more colourful contemporary point-and-clicks, especially when it comes to the character animation. It also makes it somewhat hard to find those small details you need to find. The interface is a bit clunky, including some places where you need to click Use to give someone something, or you give someone a thing, but it just opens the normal dialogue tree and you have to choose the correct option to actually give it to them. Finally, there are a few late-game bugs, with one puzzle that can be soft-locked if you do things in the wrong order, and another where the hotspot inside something you need to open comes up before you've opened it, which had me stumped for a good 20 minutes or so, far longer than I should admit to. But here's the thing, it's Sherlock Holmes. It feels like a proper Holmes game, where you wander around carefully deducting things through observation and logic, rather than making wacky bizarro world combinations of items. And in wandering around, I've seen that Holmes's London was indeed muted, pastel-coloured, and when it comes to this game's locations in particular, often private property. There's a reason this is viewed as one of the most authentic pieces of Sherlock media by its fans, and there are quite a few of those. While Serrated Scalpel was never a strong seller in its day, it was a consistent seller, eventually racking up the magic number of over 100,000 copies sold. Not quite the heights of ICOM's full-motion video consulting detective games, but still respectable. And whether or not you consider yourself part of the more than a century-old Holmes fandom, if you have just watched an entire video of this man going on pointlessly about where the character came from, obscure details of settings, and really far too much about street numbering and copyright, I feel it's the sort of thing which is worth giving a chance. As for me, where else could I end this but the first place I found all day to explicitly describe itself as being public? The Sherlock Holmes Public House.